Trump administration announced a 30% tariff on South Africa.
I think we're going to have a market the likes of which nobody's ever seen before, not in this country.
We are essentially here to reset the relationship between the United States and South Africa.
Donald Trump's 30% tariff is now in effect.
Economists have already predicted that economic growth will slow from 1.2% down to 1%.
South African government says it is finalizing a package to support companies that will be affected.
South Africa already has the second highest level of unemployment in the world, just after Eswatini.
Thank you for joining me to discuss this very important topic that is impacting several African countries, and most importantly, South Africa. Trump, in his administration, has imposed heavy tariffs on many countries, and this trade war started with China, and now it has impacted African countries the most. And as I mentioned, South Africa is at the forefront at the 30% mark. Can you speak to what this means for the South African economy, as the U.S. is its second largest trading partner?
Look, so South Africa, firstly, is at a moment where I would categorize the country as at a rebuilding phase. We spent almost a decade under what we call the state capture, where the country has seen its economy growing for less than 2% for a prolonged period. And now we have what we call the government of national unity, where basically it's for the first time since 1994, we are having some of those strong coalition, different political parties leading the South African government, and therefore President Ramaphosa putting us in this environment where I would say we are rebuilding and getting back to the momentum that we had pre-financial crisis. And part and parcel of that growth strategy involves having to export to a number of markets. China is an important market, but of course then the US and the EU. And about 7% of our exports go to the US. Not everything in that basket is going to fill these tariffs, but certainly the auto industry and agriculture. So we're worried about employment. We're worried about what this means for growth. In our figures, we think it will take about 0.2% from the growth prospects.
But Wandile, why is South Africa behind the eight ball? Meaning, this almost comes as a shock to South Africa and its playing defense, as opposed to have been proactive in creating policies and diversifying its markets, ensuring that, exporters are not solely dependent on the U.S. market, but already having existing other secondary or third or fourth markets that they could have automatically just deferred to instead of scrambling. Why is South Africa behind the eight ball?
I mean, look, South Africa is not alone on scrambling to get into the U.S. The reality is that America is an important consumer market. There's higher purchasing power. It's an important economy. So you always want to be part of that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be diversifying, because if you look at the South African exports, we are generally more diversified to an extent. You could make that argument, because in the EU, we have exports to a number of countries. Then you have Asia. It's not only China, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. We have presence in those markets. But there are certain products that you manufacture targeting a certain market. Take in this example, the auto industry. In East London, in the eastern, southern regions of South Africa, we produce Mercedes-Benz C-Class. They are produced for the American market, manufactured in a particular way, and you can't swiftly move them to say, now suddenly we will send them to Japan. There is that reliance. But also, let's face it, America for a long period has been a predictable and a trustworthy partner, and everyone wants to continue to do business with the U.S., which is why even the government message out of South Africa speaks to exactly that.
Oh, absolutely. But, the talk of renewing AGOA has been on the tables since his first term, and it rolled over to the Biden administration, who barely addressed it. And a lot of African countries, including South Africa, has sent delegations to see if this could be expedited to be renewed. with that in mind, I'm just curious to just hear why the concerns of, especially small companies who are a part of the chain of supplying goods to the U.S., their concerns, it seems like it was unaddressed, especially speaking to the fact that South Africa is the second world's largest unemployment. It has the largest unemployment, it's the second largest unemployment in the world. With that in mind, why wasn't, honestly, just speaking to the continent, why weren't we ready? Why were we just scrambling now, realizing that this tariff war, trade war is not just with China, it's with all of us?
I mean, firstly, for people who may not have followed on what the whole AGOA conversation is about, AGOA is a unilateral arrangement that the US offers to the African continent to say, look, you can send some of your goods at tariff-free as long as you are at a certain level of development. Now, a number of countries have largely dependent on it. I'm thinking here of small countries like Lesotho, who has a strong textile industry, almost as what you see in Bangladesh. Has been some of the major dependence on that. But South Africa, this has been on the crosshairs for some time. I mean, I'm thinking back now in 2014. At the time, the point was that South Africa is now an upper middle income country. It has graduated to a certain extent on a category at which we had put on to say we categorize countries as this way to benefit on this. In addition to that, you fast forward, there's been legislation that the US did not fully appreciate much in South Africa. Either it's an intellectual property bill that we brought out in 2020. Therefore, some geopolitical differences to a certain extent have added to the mix of those challenges. And I think those are the risks related to AGOA. But the point is that South Africa's intention has always been AGOA is a stepping stone to thereafter graduating and forming a free trade agreement, just like what Kenya had already started in previous term of President Trump. Kenya began doing that. And if you look at the tariffs Kenya is facing now, it's in fact around about 10%, because let's face it, these tariffs are not necessarily, at least in my view, calculated on the basis of what we hear being communicated, trade balance or whatever, the formula of arriving on it. It's something that many people disagree, and even ourselves, because South Africa doesn't have that level of protection. If you look at the tariffs that South Africa imposes to the world, on average, what we call most favored nations tariff is about 7.6%. So to categorize us as being a protectionist at a closed market, it's actually a misinterpretation of what's going on. But the point is, to what you are saying.
I can agree with that, in that the Trump administration seems to have this understanding that its trade tariffs or policies are not reciprocated from recipient countries, that seems to have favors, and especially facing developing countries like the sub-Saharan countries. But with that said, there are so many goods that come through WTO and other things, but this tariff just adds an additional cost to smaller consumers. Like most exporters to the U.S., they don't have the capital to consume this tariff, and results in losing jobs. And South Africa now has put in place certain things in response to this, which is also the explanation of how it is aggressively diversifying its markets. It has set up a help desk for companies that are going to be heavily impacted by this. And, like as you mentioned, in the automotive industry as well as the agricultural industry are the ones that are heavily hit. Now, where are these goods going to go? Because some of these terms are negotiated years and years out. And these tariffs are not something that these smaller countries could suddenly say, hey, because you're imposing this tariff on me, now I have to charge my client this additional cost that I'm having to consume. That's not how it works. So how were the exporters going to adjust to this new cost that they are having to deal with?
I mean, look, I would start off to your previous question to say, why were we not ready? Nobody was ready about this because, I mean, Japan was just facing its own issues. The EU, Switzerland last week were engaging with President. So the whole world did not think we could actually see the level of dislocations that all of us are seeing now in global trade. So I wouldn't necessarily say one or the other should have diversified more on this. But the point you're making is correct, which is that how do we move from here? And I think you probably had seen the news out of South Africa that the South African president had a phone call and engagement with President Trump. The idea from our side is that we need to mend the relationship and try to bring the tariffs down. And at the same time, concurrently be opening up export markets in other regions, because no one wants to replace the US. That's certainly not our intention. Our intention is to ensure that there's more choice for businesses to actually be able to get to other areas, not only just for South Africa, but for South Africa and the Southern African countries around us who also have to see how they survive in this new environment. Now, quickly, you are right. It takes time to open new export markets. On average, to get a trade deal in the the liberation tariffs, when the environment was different, it would take you at least about 5 years to do that. Right now, though, there are new developments. I mean, China, about 2 or 3 weeks back, they just came out and saying, look, we will lower the tariffs for all of the African countries wanting to deepen their trade with the African continent. They've began rolling out that project. So we need to look into that, because it looks similarly to what AGOA was, but also not look at it with complacency that we had with AGOA, but rather to say it is a transitional part, so that at some point there must be a bilateral agreement. But the small businesses, you are right, they suffer more than the big businesses that may have some linkages to other areas, which is why then I think the domestic governments providing whatever necessary support to medium and small businesses is necessary. And that's exactly what, through the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa, we are attempting to do, as well as even exempting some competition aspects so that when they can collaborate and coordinate for a period, they are able to do that so that they absorb some of these costs. And I will say this, in the coming months, we will also be reviewing some of the support that we could add. But not all African countries have the luxury and the fiscal capacity to do that. And then that then puts them in a very, very difficult position for the coming months.
Yeah, South Africa's economy is intertwined, not just a standalone economy, it's intertwined with the other landlocked countries in the Southern Africa. So how high of a priority is intracontinental trading for South Africa at the moment? Because in times of challenge, looking inward is the best thing sometimes. So is South Africa prioritizing trading with its neighbors and even further up to the Horn in West Africa and so forth?
I mean, look, the African continent has always been an important trading partner for South Africa. I'll give you an example of just taking the agricultural sector, since it's one of the most affected one with the US. If you look at how much South Africa's exports, South Africa exports about half of what it produces in agriculture. That's just under $14 billion each year in the agricultural sector. About half of that is with the African continent. But the interesting thing is that not all of the African continent, about 90 cents in every dollar, it's the Southern Africa region. So we could look then to say, what can you do in the further East Africa, further West Africa? But the complexity that South Africa confronts in here is, one, the products that we actually exporting, the demand for them in other parts of the world, of the continent, as well as the buying power, quite frankly, it remains in some of these products relatively small. So, which is why now I think that the regional cooperation to say, how do we improve? Because you don't have the consumer spending of the US, of Japan in the continent, and you want to sell high value products where you are able to be somewhat labor intensive and employ more people, then you face those demand challenges in the continent. But that doesn't block the point of saying we could still increase intertrade. And with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it's part and parcel of that. Lastly, the other challenge here is always also the fact that businesses have to move around and see where they have much more stronger linkages, because the South African government cannot dictate what the businesses can do, but it can clear the path. But the individual decisions still depend on the business leaders. But we must support the small and the medium scale businesses so that they are able to have a launching pad on whatever that they do.
Thank you so much, Wandile, for joining me today to discuss this very important and critical topic. We're going to defer back to you when we hear new information about how South Africa is moving forward in negotiating its tariff deal with the United States. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.